have some very good news for you today. The social engineering project of transgenderism and mutilating children seems to finally be coming to an end. This article comes to us from Zero Hedge. Surprising shift. Transgender bubble pops at colleges. It says Democrats and their radical leftist allies need an urgent wake-up call after betting the entire political strategy on transgender ideology, which most notably is the effort to queer America's youth into gender-fluid left-wing activists operating in schoolyards and on city streets. That strategy appears to be collapsing, if it hasn't already, as a new study reveals a sharp decline in youngsters identifying as something they're not. In short, youngsters appear to be rejecting the multi-decade social engineering experiment by leftist public school bureaucrats, Hollywood progressive doctors, left-wing NGOs, and other ideological operatives aligned with that globalist agenda. The article goes on. New data from Dr. Eric Kaufman, professor of politics at the University of Buckingham and director of the Center for Heterodox Social Science, revealed a surprising trend that may concern strategists of the Democratic Party. And I'll just issue that same warning to pretty much every single Western government that keeps pushing this. It's going to continue going in this direction. You can see the graph there. New trans identification is in freefall among the young. In Kaufman's report titled The Decline of Trans and Queer Identity Among Young Americans, he discovered that since 2023, both trans and queer identification have fallen sharply among members of Generation Z. Here are the key findings from the report that was condensed and repackaged for consumption on the British news and opinion website Unheard. First of all, sharp decline in trans and queer identities. Among US university students, the transgender share fell from 7% in 2023 to under 4% in 2025. Non-heterosexual identification dropped by about 10 points in the same period. Most affected categories declines are concentrated in queer, pansexual, asexual, and bisexual identities. Gay and lesbian shares remain stable. Generational reversal. Freshmen are now less likely to identify as bisexual, trans, or queer than seniors, implying that the downward trend is continuing. Elite institutions lead the decline. Schools such as Andover Phillips Academy and Brown University show the steepest drops, suggesting the trend began in elite academic settings. Non-binary identification fell roughly by half across Fire, Brown, and Andover data sets between 22 and 25. As far as sexual orientation goes, bisexual peaked around 2022 to 23, now retreating. Queer and other rose sharply through 2023, then collapsed by 2025. Gay, lesbian, stable near 3 to 5%. Heterosexual rebounded to between 77 and 82% across major data sets by 2025. Kaufman on X published a wild chart pack that shows the data cited from major youth surveys, including Fire, Harry, Brown, Daily Herald, Andover Phillips Academy, CCES, GSS, and CDC YRBSS, that shows the trans bubble has popped. Non-conforming sexual identity, meaning queer, questioning, etc., is also in sharp decline. Gay and lesbian are stable, while heterosexuality has rebounded by around 10 points since 2023. Not only this, but freshmen in 24 to 25 were less trans and queer than seniors, whereas it was the reverse when BTQ plus identity was surging in 22 to 23. This suggests that gender or sexual nonconformity will continue to fall. What explains the sudden reversal of trans and queer? Well, it's not because the kids became less woke, more religious, or more conservative. Apparently, those beliefs remained stable throughout the 2020s. Is it improved mental health? Yes, in part. Less anxious and especially depressed students is linked with smaller share identifying as trans, queer, or bisexual. But not entirely. Mental illness fell after the pandemic, but the sexuality and gender shifts happened at least a year later. All groups, including LGBT, got less mentally ill after the pandemic. The decline in anxiety and depression occurred within trans, bisexual, and queer groups as much as among others. So it wasn't the case that most of those who solved their emotional problems became heterosexual. The fall of trans and queer seems most similar to the fading of a fashion or trend. It happened largely independently of shifts in political beliefs and social media use, though improved mental health played a role. So what's the bigger picture here? Well, just like that, the trans bubble has burst. explained away by improved mental health. But the real question now is, where's the accountability for the politicians, doctors, educators, and left-wing activists who spent years pushing the sexualization and queering of America's youth for a sinister globalist agenda? There must be accountability, and the full report is linked there on that article as well. Apart from the accountability part, which I don't think we're going to get, this is a very, very good example of free speech. Let me explain. We were very, very silenced and heavily criticized for talking about the fact that it's actually not a good idea to mutilate children's genitals, and that this was a fad and this was a fashion trend and that it was going to pass. And you recall how many people were striked on social media or YouTube for talking about these things. But what happens in the end? Well, just like any trend that is not good for society or any issue stemming from potential mental health concerns, free speech eventually rises to the surface, and so does common sense and sanity. That is why things like this are so suppressed. Whenever something is not good for society, the only solution that these tech oligarchs and those in charge of everyone come to is we must suppress it so that we continue this destruction. This is another example of how, regardless of all of that censorship, regardless of the demonization of all of the people who were saying this does not make sense and this is unnatural and it's got to stop, despite all of the attacks on those people, they persisted, and common sense through free speech eventually rose to the surface. Society will always sort itself out. It will always weed out the terrible things within it if people are allowed to talk about them. So I, for one, see this as a huge victory, and I hope and believe that we'll continue to see these figures going down, more and more people having children, having natural families, and continuing to populate this earth.